Today we're going to be in the cars section. We're going to be using the AAMC sample test, and we're going to be on cars passage number 6. And this one's actually a fun one, so let's go ahead and take a look at it. First thing I always do is I always read the title, see if it gives me any clues. It says the first salute, gives me 0 clues. I don't know what the heck we're talking about. But I'm going to read this passage. I'm going to break it down to its main idea. I'm going to try to interpret the author's tone, arguments, etc. And we're going to apply that main idea to all these questions, and I'm going to show you how to get them correct. So this passage says, the lesson was not yet clear in the 18th century that the presence of disunity in the military about method and strategy, and among the nation's people about the rightness of the war aim, makes it impossible for a war of any duration to be fought effectively and won. Okay, they're doing one of my biggest pet peeves right off the bat. I can't stand when they do this. They use all these negatives. The lesson was not yet clear that the presence of the disunity, it just makes it hard to understand. But what they're trying to say here is that the population they're describing didn't understand that you needed a plan in order to win a war. That's pretty much what they were going at. So we need a plan to win a war. That's what the author. The accepted view was that inadequate naval force was the primary reason for Britain's defeat in the war for American independence. Okay, so it seems like we're talking about Britain and America, maybe the Revolutionary War. But notice here how they say the accepted view. Now, it's a very finicky way to word this, because if they frame something as the accepted view, usually it's the author kind of positioning themselves to disagree with that view. So your job, whenever you see something like that, the accepted review or the consensus or the classical opinion, any of those things, your job is to A, identify that argument, figure out what that view is, and B, ask yourself, does my author agree with this view or not? So now I'm asking myself, does the author agree with the view that the reason that America won the war for American independence is because Britain's navy sucked? Is that the reason why? Second sentence says, disunited and ill-disciplined, the British Royal Navy certainly was. Okay, so we're kind of going back to this idea of disunity that was mentioned here. Its numbers were too few for its tasks. Its governors were men of limited intelligence, limited experience, no coherent strategy, and unlimited assurance of winning. At no time in the war did they take seriously the possibility of the Americans winning. Okay, so it sounds like we started to move towards, like, away from the idea that it was an inadequate naval force and more towards the idea of, like, the leaders fumbled the ball, like they just kind of suck. And so I'm starting to think that no, my author does not agree with this accepted view, that my author thinks that it was probably something that the people at the top of the British Navy were doing. So let's keep reading. See if it's in that same vein to confirm your kind of hypothesis. Inadequacy of decision-making by the war cabinet was a primary defect. Okay, so does this sound like a inadequate naval fleet? Does it sound like they don't have enough ships, or like their soldiers are not good shots or something? I don't know what you do in the Navy. No, this kind of sounds like the political leaders or the generals just weren't very competent. Lord Sandwich, all right, what a name, begged the king to require that, quote, meetings of the cabinet should reduce its decisions to writing, and when a question is agitated, it ought to be decided one way or another and not be put off as now most frequently happens without any determination. So this Lord Sandwich actually has a good idea. He or she is saying, look, whenever we have a problem that's coming up, we're just tabling it and we're not actually coming to a solution, and that's why we're getting our crap rocked by the Americans. So can we please come to a decision whenever a problem arises? Failure to focus available resources on a single objective and give that objective absolute priority was a major failure in strategy. Okay, so I like the way that they put this, the idea of like a failure in strategy. That way it's not necessarily framing everybody as incompetent, but maybe just like they just don't feel a sense of urgency to be organized and approach this as a serious problem or a serious threat. So it sounds like old Lord Sandwich got told that his idea was a no-go. Anyways, sorry Sandwich. In 1778, Britain had no one capable of a decisive determination of that kind, not the king. While George III had no trouble making up his mind, it contained only one idea, to conquer, but not how. So he knew what he wanted, he didn't know how to get there. The king's two chief war ministers, Germain and Sandwich, the guy, were emphatic enough, but not usefully, having no clear plan of strategy and sloppy about implementing any plan they conceived. Basic fault was complacency rather than mental incapacity. So I'm going to work backwards. This here, it tells us that like they weren't stupid. They were just kind of complacent. They didn't feel this sense of urgency. But this description that the author has here of Germain and Sandwich, they sound like the people that can recognize a problem, but they don't know the solution. It's kind of like whenever you're going out to eat and you're like, hey, what do you want to eat? And they're like, oh, I don't really care. You're like, great, let's go to Buffalo Wild Wings. And they're like, I would rather eat dog poop. And you're like, okay, what if we go to Outback? A little blooming onion, a little steak. And they're like, I think I'd rather eat more dog poop. And you're like, what? It sounds like you just want dog poop. But that's what Jermaine and Sandwich are doing. It's like they have an idea or a view of what they don't like or what's wrong, but they're not offering any solutions. And the author is kind of wrapping that up in a bow as this idea of complacency and saying they're not stupid, they just don't really know how to get there. The danger in complacency is that it causes the possessor to ignore as unimportant the local factors and conditions that govern other people with whom it deals. That's very wordy, and this whole passage has been super wordy, so good job if you're sticking with me this far. But when something's super wordy like this, I have two approaches. The first one is I'll try to kind of break it down into smaller pieces and see if I can understand it. And then the second one is I'll just keep reading to see if I can get context. And so I would probably go back and kind of skim this sentence because it didn't really make a ton of sense to me. But I imagine this is going to be one I have to keep reading. It says the danger in complacency is, so what's bad about complacency, which is what Sandwich and Jermaine were, is that it causes the possessor, which is Sandwich and Jermaine, to ignore as unimportant the local factors and conditions that govern other people with whom it deals. So it's saying if you're complacent, then you just completely blow off the local factors for other individuals. And so I'm assuming they're talking about like the local governance of America, or maybe like the daily life of America and something like that. But let's keep reading for context. Britons faced with the American Revolution were not interested in Americans or in their magnificent continent reaching from ocean to ocean. Woo! Little bias right there, huh? No British monarch had ever seen his domain across the Atlantic, and no British minister in the 15 years when insurgency was brewing to a boil visited the colonies to learn what was exercising the unruly subjects or what kind of people they were. Okay, so our hunch was kind of right. They had no clue what the Americans were. We didn't really know what their life was about. They had ignored that. Complacency had forced them to ignore American life. The consequence was ignorance, which is a disadvantage in war. The consequence of not visiting and ignoring the Americans was ignorance, which is a disadvantage in war. That disadvantage is probably why they lost, right? So not an inadequate naval force, but this ignorance of American life due to complacency. So let's keep reading. Planlessness followed from the start of the war when the British assumed that no plan was needed to suppress a rebellion, only hard blows. Carelessness followed from the assumption that the superiority of British force was so great that it made taking pains in performance unnecessary. A more basic deteriorating factor was dissension at home. So they're saying that they even split their time between Britain and America. You know, they weren't super worried about making this big plan for America because it was just like 400 people over there, and they were like, well, we're just going to go hit them really hard and then they'll stop. But our author is telling us that that was probably pretty careless, and that carelessness came from the fact that they thought that they were just so much stronger than America. The last paragraph seems to take a little bit of a pivot, but let's see if we can tie it together. Politics, as much as anything, defeated the British in the American War. Okay, so politics, we were kind of on this idea of like complacency and strategy and unfamiliarity with the American land. So you have to ask yourself, how does politics fit in with that? Because this is an additional argument. So how does that fit in with it? Let's keep reading to find out. The British have always been obsessed with politics, not so much in terms of opposing systems of belief as in terms of who's in and who's out. Transmitted to the Navy, it cut like a carving knife through the solidity of the senior service. So violent was the spirit of party and faction in the fleet as almost to extinguish every patriotic sentiment. So this is another explanation of kind of like the higher ups in the British life and the British military failed the military effort because they were so worried about political gain and who was in control and who was in power. So it kind of ties in by it was completely detracting from the war effort, and it led to more and more planlessness. And that seems to be a pretty common theme here. So what was the main idea? My main idea, I said, poor planning or politics by the British military leaders led to complacency or ignorance, which ended up losing them the war. I tried to take all the big arguments and smash them together. Now, keep in mind, I left out some of the smaller arguments, but the main idea has all the big hitting ones, and it has enough for us to be able to go back through the passage if we need to find anything. So let's go ahead, take question number 31, which says, the passage suggests that the outcome of the Revolutionary War could have been altered if what? So simplifying this question, what does the passage say the British people did wrong, and how could we fix it? A says, had Britain's Navy been allowed to fight in force? Probably not. We didn't hear anything about this idea of Britain being unable to like go all out. So maybe not A. Didn't hear anything about it. B says, had Britain committed itself to a war of longer duration? We didn't really hear anything about them like running out of gas or just getting tired, so maybe not B. C says, had Britain developed a comprehensive strategic plan? So had they gotten better at planning, right? That was the whole idea. So maybe C. Maybe they could have won the war if they had planned better. And then D says, had King George III been in charge of the British plans? Now remember, King George III, they kept talking about how like he knew he wanted to conquer, but he didn't really know how to do it. So maybe not to D. Correct answer would be C. Number 32 says, according to the passage, the British assumed that they would be victorious over the colonists, and why? So why did Britain think that they would just run the show with the colonists, or what led to their arrogance? A says the element of surprise. Were the British arrogant because of the element of surprise? Probably not. We didn't hear anything about surprise, so maybe not A. B says a strategic employment of forces. Did we read anything about Britain's overwhelmingly cunning strategies? Probably not, right? We talked about how they were a little bit dumb in their approach, so maybe not B. C says the colonies' unwillingness to fight. Maybe this one's an attractive one because it's not as easily ruled out as some of the others, but we really didn't get anything on the colonies besides the fact that they won. So maybe not to C. And D says a vastly superior military force. So why was Britain kind of big-headed? It's because they were like, look, this is just a small little colony. We have this huge military. We will run them over. So that was mentioned in the passage. So we'll go with answer choice D, and that lines up with the main idea. Number next says, according to the passage, it is true of King George III that he what? So which of these is a true statement? Now, I know a lot of people like to go through here and like once they figure out that one is correct or incorrect, they'll like go down and rule out all the answer choices that don't agree with that approach. I don't think that's a good idea. It ends up wasting a lot of time. The best way to do these is go through these three statements and figure out which one of these is a true statement, which one of these is a false statement. And once you get all the true statements, then you just pick the answer choice that aligns with it. So statement 1 says King George III had trouble making up his mind. No, remember, we even talked about this in a previous answer choice. George III knew what he wanted, he just didn't know how to get it. So I don't like statement 1. 2 says he wanted conquest but had no plan. That's essentially what they described him as. He was only in there briefly because he was a small argument, but that is exactly what they described him as. So I think 2 is a true statement. And 3 says had a detailed plan of how to win the war. No, the whole passage was saying that like had he had that plan that he would have won the war. So I don't like 3. 2 is the only one that's true, and the answer choice that agrees with that is B. Number 34 says, which of the following conclusions would be most in accord with the theme of the passage? This is saying which of these is closest to your main idea. If you see something like this, you better go read your main idea. Okay, it's not going to be the same exact thing, but it's going to be close in theme. So let's look over our main idea again. Poor planning or politics by the British military leaders led to complacency or ignorance of colonial life, which ended up losing the war. Okay. A says politics often detracts from a war effort, right? Didn't we just talk about how politics was kind of the reason that we lost the war? A is okay. It's not wrong. I really want an answer choice that says something about like planning and poor strategy though, because that seemed to be what they focused on the most. But if A is the best answer choice, I'm going to go with it. So maybe to A. B says settlement by treaty. Okay, you can stop there. We didn't talk about treaty at all. Is the only option to colonial war. Don't stop there, but you could have. So I don't like B, though. We didn't talk about a treaty. C says a country's leaders should decide if war is justified and then delegate strategy to the military. I bet this one's attractive. I bet a lot of you would pick this one because it mentions strategy. But notice here, remember, they're asking for the theme. What's the main idea? This theme makes it sound like the King George III, should have been talked about the whole time. It doesn't say a country's military leaders. It says a country's leader, which is, I guess, King George III at that time, should decide if a war is justified. We didn't talk about like the ethics of the war, and we did not talk about how King George III should delegate strategy. So even though it says strategies, and I said I wanted something that said that, that's not correct. So maybe not to C. D says powerful countries throughout the ages have promoted peace through compromise. Okay, this whole thing's about a war. So maybe not D. We didn't reach a treaty. We didn't reach any peace act. So B and D are both wrong. And C is incorrect because it focuses on King George III, whereas this passage was over, it was kind of like a critique of British military leadership as a whole, rather than saying like one person really screwed the pooch here. So the correct answer here would be A, even though you and I could probably write a more correct answer, something that would look like this. A is the best answer, and that's what you're looking for on the MCAT, is the best answer. So that's A, 35, I believe. It says, according to the passage, Britain's complacency toward the colonies resulted in a what? So remember, we had this idea of poor planning or politics led to complacency or ignorance, and that led to a loss of war. So what does this say? Britain's complacency resulted in what? Okay, so they were let's kind of ask ourselves, what was Britain too complacent to do? So they were too complacent to go visit. So once they didn't visit, then they had less knowledge about American life. And once they had less knowledge, then that led to ignorance, which ended up leading to losing the war. Losing war. I'm going to be a doctor, not an English teacher. So, but I still have to write notes, so I need to learn. A says a lack of knowledge about colonial life. Well, that's in our little flowchart type thing. So maybe to answer choice A. B says buildup of American forces. This one's attractive because obviously the American forces were strong enough to beat Britain, but I don't remember the passage necessarily talking about how America had like this overwhelming force. I think the whole theme of the passage is that Britain should have won on paper, but they were ignorant of American life and how America was set up, and so they got rocked. So maybe not to be. So he says rivalry between political factions. You will pick C, or if you pick C, then I want you to know your problem is that you are holding on to small arguments and you're trying to apply them over the entirety of the passage, aka you're taking a smaller argument, and it's usually going to be the one that is at the end, because remember your recency bias that you learned in Psych Soc, or you learned for Psych Soc. You're going to take that argument and you're going to make it the main idea. And that is why, if you've ever noticed that it seems like the MCAT frequently throws you a curveball as you get to the very last paragraph, it's so that you'll do that. It's so that you'll latch onto this argument and try to apply it broadly. But that's not the main idea. Remember, the main idea can be in the last paragraph, but it's usually not, because that would be too easy. That would be the ACT. So if you pick C, it's because you jumped on this idea of politics and you just didn't let it go. But they talked about how political efforts could detract from it, but it didn't talk about like any harsh rivalry. And that word has some bite to it, and there's a reason behind that. There's a reason that they chose that word. We can talk about political factions. Remember, they didn't say that it was necessarily the British equivalent of Republican versus Democrat. They said that it was just like a who's contest, or who's in versus who's out, rather than which faction is in or which methodology is ruling at the time. So maybe not to C. And then D says Britain's complacency resulted in a base of power for the British Empire. No, that's exactly opposite, right? Like it led to them getting stripped of their power because they lost control of the colonies, which we now know as America. So the correct answer here would be A. And then number last, which I believe is 36, says, based on the passage, it is reasonable to conclude that a nation's war effort is significantly affected by the what? Wasn't that like the whole thing that we talked about? Wasn't the whole passage about what can distract you from being successful in a war effort? So this is another main idea question, just like most of these are. A says, development of war-related technology. Did we talk about technology? No. Don't make any leaps. Don't try to convince yourself that technology would have been helpful because the British Navy was inadequate or something like that. You can make those leaps if you let your brain do it. Don't. Maybe not A. B says, attitudes and perceptions of its leaders. I like B. Because the leaders didn't plan well. They were complacent. They were ignorant. And I like that it says leaders rather than, King George III or Lord Sandwich or something like that. So maybe to B. C says the ability to quickly mobilize troops and supplies. We didn't talk about honestly, even though he kind of criticized the military effort and strategy, the author didn't really go into like what exactly was wrong about it, besides the fact that it was ignorance of American life. So C is a little bit of a leap, and that's what I call an illogical leap. Sometimes the MCAT's going to require you to make small little adjustments on the fly and to make small little assumptions, and I call those logical steps. And it's basically the idea of, if you see smoke, it is logical and reasonable to say, oh, well, there's probably a fire somewhere. But an illogical leap would be the equivalent of saying, if I see smoke, then that means that my neighbors down the road have a shrine of me, and it was just so attractive, and the shrine got so hot and the podium got so hot because the pictures were of me that it just burst into flames, and that's why I see smoke. You see the difference? So logical steps are sometimes required, but illogical leaps, if you're having to say X, Y, and then Z, those are incorrect answer choices, and they're trying to get you caught up on that. That's what C is. D says establishment of a morally correct national position. Again, we didn't really talk about morality at all, so maybe not D. And the correct answer here is answer choice B. Thanks for watching the video. Make sure to check out all the strategies and the study guides that we've got. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you next time.